before we actually start our discussion, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, and acknowledge elders past and present, and also anyone who's Indigenous in the room. They're our original storytellers, so I think it's important that we acknowledge them before we start talking to some of the storytellers we have here on the panel. So I thought to start, I might ask Sue and Rosemary, who between them have a combined approximately 50 productions that they've produced or executive produced. I guess about over the course of your career, how funding productions has changed. Is it significantly different now in terms of the recent productions you've done compared to the ones you've done earlier in your career, and has it gotten easier? Maybe I'll start with you, Sue.
Yes, it has changed. Oh, sorry. It has changed, and it changes every few years when the government changes the source of funding or the method of delivery of funding. What really hasn't changed, I suppose, is the gap, which is what we're kind of here to talk about today. In some ways it's easier now. I think the offset has had a lot of benefits that I personally couldn't see in the beginning, but I do now. So that really helps a lot. The government agencies are mostly quite well funded, not everywhere, but it's different. But it's always just as hard, really. It depends on the project you've got and how much anybody else wants it. Rosemary, what do you think?
I agree. I think what's happening at the moment, though, which is really challenging, is that the whole, I suppose I'm talking particularly about film. The whole world is so challenged about, is there an audience for film? How are we dealing? The independent sector worldwide is challenged about how to get an audience into the cinema. So even though as producers, as storytellers, directors, we should always go, well, who is our audience? Now, if you're not really, really, really clear, it's not like you may, in the old days, like 5 years ago, you'd put out a good psychological drama and you might make $2-3 million. Now, you may make nothing. No one may turn up to your movie. It's really, so it's changed quite dramatically, and when you go out trying to raise that gap, you have to be very, very, very clear about how you're going to get people to walk through the door.
Yeah. It's interesting. At the Australian Movie Convention this year, they were talking about last year's Australian films, and out of all of the Australian films that come out last year, only 2 did more than $3 million at the box office, and the rest in the top 5 were at 2 point something. So when you actually start understanding what that means in terms of cinema goers actually showing up and paying to see Australian films, I think it takes a lot of people by surprise to actually think what those numbers really are.
Yeah, and I just don't think it's Australian films. I agree. I think some great independent films. I'm sure, Simon, you've got that experience that is a great film, and 3 years ago you would probably guarantee a number. But so it's obviously Sue's got a great story to tell with Ladies in Black, so the audience is there.
Yes.
But it's just a bit harder to identify.
But those low numbers also spook the distributors and the people who are picking up your film, so that makes it just that much harder for everybody else, I think. Ladies in Black just happened to be a moment in a time, and an amazing co-producer I had who really made sure that, kind of got people to come on board. But normally I think if distributors concerned, because at those numbers they make very little, and the exhibitors always make something, but they're that much more reluctant then to take on an Australian film.
Yeah. So as you mentioned before, we're talking about funding the gap. Given I wouldn't expect everybody in this audience to have a really good understanding of what funding of a film might look like in Australia, would you mind just giving a general overview about what the different elements are and what that gap ends up being?
Yeah, I can sort of without boring you to death, I can run you through the breakdown on Ladies in Black. And at this stage, remember that nobody knew the film was going to work. So you start with the offset, I suppose. You start with 100%. That's your budget, and the offset, is nominally 40%. So you can probably guarantee 35%. Then there's a combination of government agencies. Screen Australia has able to put up to, I think, 1.82 million into a film if they choose to. So you add all that together, and then you get your distribution and distribution advance, which usually, sometimes it's cash flowed, sometimes you have to borrow against it, as you do with the offset, so you've got interest. So you add all the things that you know you can get if the film, if everybody wants to come in on board, and you add that up. And in the case of Ladies in Black, it came to about 76% of 100% of the budget. So we've still got 30%. Where do you get that from? And every film is different. In our case, we got people, some people to invest who were involved in the film. Alana, Bruce and I invested quite a lot of our fees. We had to roll those over. That's no fun because you then have to pay tax on it. So you've got to hope the film makes any money. And then we were able to get some private investors, which brought us out at 99.74%. I'm not sure what happened to the rest of it. It's floating around somewhere. But that's kind of where you start with 100. You go with all the obvious ones: the government agencies, the offset, distribution, and then there's the gap. So that kind of sets it up anyway. Yeah.
That's perfect. And I should mention we will open for questions towards the end. So if you do have questions, please hang on to them and I will come out to the audience. So, Rosemary, on a project like Upgrade and the Sapphires, which were very commercial, where do you start? Where do you start in terms of raising the finance?
Well, they're both very different scenarios and very different times. Sapphires was released in 2012, so the 4 years prior was the raising of the funds. It was really hard. No one thought it was commercial. They never think about that later. And it was a first-time filmmaker, and it wasn't cheap. I had a couple of supporters in the agencies who'd agreed with me that just because you're a first-time director doesn't mean you should do it cheaply, because it's really hard to make a film. So we stuck to our guns on the budget level. We got very similar. We got that 70% that Sue was talking about, and then we went around the world looking for 30%. And literally, we sang it. Wayne Blair took around. We had this little sort of, at that time, it wasn't even a Bluetooth, this little sort of, cassette player or, CD player, and we'd press go and we would sing it out. all over Canada. I think I probably saw Simon there. All through the UK, all through, in the end, Asia. We ended up with these English partners. And they were like, this is amazing. And it was all very cool, and we thought, we've done it. We went to Screen Australia and said, we've got all the bits, it's going to be fantastic, we're ready to go. 6 weeks later, 6 weeks before shoot, I'm ringing them up going, it's really good, all the things are in place, we're going to go. And they said, oh no, we don't want to do it anymore. And it's like, oh my God. Literally, I'm almost like, and this is not an unusual story. And I've got actors. I've got beautiful Miranda and Jess and Shari and Deb Malman doing singing lessons and dancing lessons with Stephen Page. It was a nightmare. It was absolutely a nightmare. And it was something I learnt. There was someone within an agency who wasn't within the investment portfolio. At that time, it was the FFC. He worked a lot within Asia, and he said, you know what? There's these people in Singapore and I think you should go and see them. And they were literally a construction company. So I went to Singapore and I went and met these people who build buildings at Olympic Park in Sydney. That's where that's all they knew about Australia. And I went in there and the guy who ran it was a musicologist. So he knew so much about soul music. So I sang, because Wayne said, I'm not going. You work it out. So literally sang, and they came in and they funded the entire gap. Now, thankfully, that was a great experience for them because they got the entire gap back, and it was a really good experience for them. But that's how close to the bone that was. And that was we financed that film out of pure passion and belief. And, because Chris O'Dowd wasn't a star. He was just the guy from Bridesmaids who was the policeman. And no one really, the guy from the IT crowd. So it was hardly Hugh Jackman, who everyone wanted us to have, everybody. There was plenty of people willing to give money to you if you can get Hugh Jackman, apparently. But Hugh can't be in every movie.
Or Kate Blanchett could have played it, because that's what
Kate
they all
could
want.
have done
Can you
it.
get Kate in that movie?
That's right. I love how... And Benedict Cumberbatch, I was suggested the other day for a role for a 20-year-old. I'm going, I'm sure he's not 20, but yeah, I could try that. So that's how that got up. We financed and made it, and that was great. And we reinvested in a similar way. Most times you'll find writers, producers, directors reinvest fees to try and raise to get to their budget level. Upgrade was a really different experience. Upgrade came to us through the US. It came through Jason Blum's company, Blumhouse. We had a relationship with them through a film we did with Joel Edgerton, and Joel did The Gift with Blumhouse. And Lee Winnell wanted to make a film back home, and he hadn't made a film in Australia. And so we were contacted, we got a very early script, we developed it with Lee, and basically this was the beautiful, so we got the rebate for the film, we got the domestic distributor, and then Jason got Universal. That's exactly how to do it. Jason, so half the budget was the world, half the budget was Australian rebate. It was a really good experience. We shot the whole thing in Melbourne. It was 100% made in Australia, and it was a really good experience for us and for Lee Winnell. You know, I won't tell you when. We didn't actually use Australian. We didn't actually use straight Australian sort of state investment or Screen Australia. So that's a very different model, but that's also a genre. It has a big international life, not a big Australian domestic life. So it's a very different model.
Yes, fantastic. Priscilla, just heading to you. So as a writer-director, I'm interested in how you're involved in the funding of the film, and where, wearing those hats, you have a role in terms of funding.
Well, I guess for me it starts with always being aware that you're never going to have the money you'd like. So even when you go to your final pass of your scripts, I'm always thinking a few things. First of all, how can I give it a visually epic feel on not much money? How can I make it step outside what could just be something that doesn't deserve to be on the big screen? So whether that's some sort of fantasy, or whether that's in the style, or whether that's, you know, you only need some key scenes that will do that will elevate what could be a story that could sit at one level and bring it to another level. The second thing, which is probably the priority thing, is, you know, it's all this, what Sue and Rosemary are talking about, is this whole finance plan is so dependent on, everyone wants to know, well, who's your cast and who's your director?
Yes.
So in my case, with The Butterfly Tree, you're an unknown director, so it's always got to be about how am I going to interest top cast, bankable cast, which is probably only 12 Australians that can carry that. So it's like, I've got to appeal to that, and if I can't appeal to that, I've definitely got to get to the next bracket down. So you go, how can I create complex characters? And if I've got someone in mind, I will go, what buttons haven't they explored in their creative life that I can offer them in this, so that they're going to be my allies, which will help the funding process. And then the third thing down is just that quite, I call it mundane, but it's like, okay, I've got 6 characters here. Do I really need 6 characters for this scene? Because I know 6 characters will cost money, and the producer's going to say to you, we need to cut 150,000 from the budget or whatever it is, and so what are you going to do about that? So I try and negate all that out in those final passes, that sort of thing. In terms of going around markets and financing and doing the whole song and dance that you do as part of that, finding international sales agents, or if there's gap money out there. I went through a very long process of making a tonal short that specifically addressed elements of that long-form project, which I knew would be challenging for investors to get their head around, to see on the page coming from a first-time director. So I'd broken this short into 3 different worlds, and so I could play a 2-minute or a 3-minute segment to speak to that challenge.
Yes.
And that, I think, was a really big plus Like that really worked really well for us, going around saying I didn't have to do so much, I didn't have to talk, I just would show the proof and there it was and they'd go, oh, I get it. So, and then in terms of how do you get more bang for your buck in terms of when you go into production, I always think, how can I inspire people to give me 200% of my team? Like the film is never my film, it's everyone on board. So I try to involve them and open that space creatively for them to give 200% because I want them to feel creative and emotional ownership in it. Mm. And so what can I do to make that happen, as well as still sticking on that path of this is your vision without, you can't get lost in that process at the same time. You can open up the space, but you can't get lost.
Yes.
So that's a few of the things that I would say that I use, that I would still try and work further on going forward in other projects.
Yes. I love that you've talked there also about creatively how you've had to find ways to essentially help with cutting of that money. And is that where you need to head if you can't raise the gap? If you come out or you've gone, you think you're there and then you've gone into Screen Australia or the state agency for some funding and you don't get as much as you're asking for and there's no other avenues that you can see left, is that where you start in terms of look at creatively where else you can find?
Well, yeah. I mean, you don't want to cut the elements out of your script because by then you've gone to the point where this is the film and this is how it has to be. So you have to try and find some other ways. In the case of Ladies in Black, we were because it was set in a department store, because it was possible to get quite a lot of sponsors. We also, Qantas put in a little bit of money, and quite a bit of it was contra, but it still counted against the budget. So if Qantas gave us $20,000 worth of airfares, which really went nowhere, but it got them a credit and the 20,000 went into the budget effectively, so we spent it. And so you look for everywhere that you can to drum up some money. Your auntie, if your auntie's got a lazy $100,000 lying around, get it. If that's what it takes.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Enzo, I want to move on to you because, as Amanda alluded to, you've done some creative raising of finance essentially, and I'm interested in how that worked on the tunnel and any lessons you've learnt, I guess, also in that process.
Sure. So the tunnel was, ended up being Australia's first crowd-funded feature film, is essentially the lead into that conversation. What we were at a place, myself and my co-producer and co-writer Julian Harvey, where we were nobodies in the film industry, right? We'd come from post-production backgrounds and we decided that we were going to have a crack at making a movie, so that's what we did. And it was at a time around 2010 when we started trying to find the finance where all of the distributors that we spoke to, especially locally, were really starting to get spooked by a sharp decline in DVD sales and home entertainment, and it was really difficult for us as a group of first-time filmmakers, our director included, who, we didn't have the track record to really guarantee a big box office or huge returns. We just couldn't find a way to make our quote-unquote proper budget add up in a way that we could go in and make a really sound business proposal to an investor. We were looking at private investment more than anything because we didn't have the track record that we would get the support from state or federal agencies. So we just started thinking outside the box a little bit and decided, it was the really early days of crowdfunding as well. I think Kickstarter was barely a thing. I think yes. the most interesting thing I'd seen financed on Kickstarter at the time was $30,000 for a RoboCop statue in Detroit, right? Like it was still this strange thing where people were raising money for odd things and some small films in North America as well. But rather than do that, we sort of came up with, because crowdfunding is hard work as well. So what we did is, rather than use a platform, we kind of, in a sense, built our own little mechanism where we came up with a really great pitch. We went back to our budget first and said, what's the absolute bare bones minimum we can make this film on in cash, and that's obviously, you know, deferring fees and reinvesting and all of that sort of, investing fees and all that sort of stuff. And came up with a number that was about 130 grand. And then did some creative math and worked out that if we took a 90-minute film and multiplied that, did some math in terms of the number of frames for each minute of the film, we came up with a number that was about 135,000 frames in a 90-minute film. And we went, okay, well, if maybe we can just sell each frame of the film as a piece of memorabilia for $1 each and raise the money that way, which is essentially the mechanism we built and what we ended up doing. Got the film made, but as part of that pitch where it's like, you give us $1, we'll give you a frame of the film. It's going to be yours, it'll have your name on it. It's going to come to you in a digital form, and we did all of those things. But we also said, well, if as an internet community, you guys are paying for it to get made, I feel kind of really crappy asking you to pay to watch it as well. So we're just going to give it back to you. And we ended up releasing it somewhat controversially on BitTorrent at the time as well. Because the main aim for the film for us was to get ourselves on the map, get noticed as filmmakers and make a mark, which we certainly did, because the BitTorrent release kind of exploded and reached something like 20 odd million people around the world, which is a phenomenal number even now when I think about it. But I think the real trick in all of that is we also managed to stitch up a lot of traditional distribution around that. So we still had the DVD sales, we still had TV, we still had a very limited but a certain amount of theatrical activity as well. So that was us going completely out of the box and going, you know, we're not going to get the $1 million that we need to make this, or whatever it was, that the number was at the time. Or we might get it, but then we know that all the people who are putting money in it are going to lose money, and we can't in good conscience do that. So, or there's a good chance that they'll lose money. So let's just rethink the entire thing. And yes, it meant that we probably didn't have a huge international theatrical rollout, but that wasn't our main priority in the exercise. So that's where that journey started for me.
So that then took you to Event Zero? It's the next.
Yeah,
next film?
so we made we won a pitching competition actually for a similar amount of money, but to make a much shorter piece of content, which was the first web series that I made. And it was still kind of genre as a bit of a thriller sort of scenario, but very experimental in the filmmaking. And the pitch competition was $100,000 from Movie Extra and Screen Australia to make 5-minute episodes that were going to get released on their YouTube channel, which is what we did. And it was just at the cusp of what has since become the boom in web series, where everybody was doing it. I mean, when we told people what we were doing with The Tunnel, and you know, we're going to go make it for $100 grand, and then we're going to give it away for free, everyone told us we were mad, absolutely mad, which at the time was probably not an inappropriate way to describe what we were doing. But then it was only a couple of years later, and around the time that we were releasing Event Zero, when suddenly everybody was doing that, or a lot of people were doing that, almost as a surrogate for what had been traditionally the short film path. Like you make a short film, you do festivals for a year, you get really noticed, lots of awards, and then you try and upscale to your first feature as a group of filmmakers. So that one was kind of really easy, and they imposed a very tight deadline on us for delivery. They were like, well, there it is, and we want it by, I think we had something like 8 months or something to make that. And so we kind of didn't really have time to engage in any other fundraising activities because we had to make the thing. So, but fast forwarding a few years later to 2 years ago, we ended up rebooting that story as a feature-length project with about 10 times that budget.
Right. And so did you go through a similar way of financing than to, I guess, like more traditional?
Absolutely, yeah. So there was there's a platform that's recently launched overseas, which is kind of like an app-based streaming platform called Black Pills. They put in about 50% of that budget, almost as a like a commission, and that took care of rest of the world for us. So we had our Australian rights, and then we plugged in a little bit of Screen Australia money and a little bit of state-based money, and sort of came up with a budget that was around about that $1 million mark. So a much more, even though the release of the rollout was probably still very non-traditional, for lack of a better way of describing it, the finance plan was very much more in line with what you would expect to see.
Yes. And at that, then you would have got the producer offset as well, in terms of that budget range.
Yep, absolutely. So, very steep learning curve.
Yes.
So we've done about 3 projects in the last 2 years using that model with those guys.
Yes. And that, I just want to ask you quickly, around that very first one you did, really to, I guess, make your mark and actually get some recognition as filmmakers, did that work for you? Did that achieve essentially what you wanted to do in terms of having something that you could showcase as an example of work?
Most definitely. I mean, it was tricky in that the film was essentially like a faux doco kind of found footage-y type film, which is part of the reason we were able to achieve it on such a low budget. So it was tough because then for about a year or so afterwards, while we were having a lot of conversations, all of the conversations were people wanting us to make found footage films, which we turned down not necessarily because they were bad projects, but we just didn't want to be the found footage dudes, you know, and I think that was a wise move. So following it up with something like Event Zero meant that we were able to display a different skill set as filmmakers, and everyone went, oh, okay, you can actually make a proper thing. So, but yes, it did work in terms of getting us the meetings, getting us in front of people, getting noticed. Our names were everywhere for a little while online, which is getting old even for us. But yes, very much achieved the desired goal.
Great. And Simon, XYZ, can you, or Z, which way do you say it?
I say Z.
Z, okay, good. I said it the right way. Can you talk us through how you fit in the funding process?
Yes. So XYZ is a sales agent production company, and I'll talk mostly about sales and a touch on production in a sec. Sue mentioned the distribution guarantee, which comes from the Australian-New Zealand distributor, and we, you know, at a certain point when the film is at marketplace, marketplace ready with a strong pathway to production, you know, we might come in with a minimum guarantee, like an MG, which is like a kind of a nominal figure for the, you know, paying for the right to sell the film. And then start looking at pre-sales. The pre-sale market's changed dramatically. It's in the last, I mean, theatricals has changed, but pre-sales have changed. It's much harder to raise money on the back of, you know, cast. It's almost like you need to have, you know, much stronger names than put forward. There's a lot of actors that used to work internationally that kind of don't at the level that you kind of need them to now. So, you know, as a sales agent, we get very involved in the casting process and feedback and looking at the estimates and looking at the value of people's names around the world and looking at how we can help, you know, bring in money for the film, which, you know, can help close the gap. Priscilla mentioned before the value of the proof of concept and having like strong work that you can show. That's also really important. We kind of see ourselves as a director-driven company, and we look at, you know, launching directors to the world, and we like kind of, you know, unearthing talent. And a way of doing that is through like previous shorts work as well as the proof of concept stuff. So it's also a way of us to, you know, maybe the cast might not be there and the film's being made for like $2 or $3 million, and they can't kind of get the name cast that's required, but the director kind of acts as that name, I guess, or the exciting person you're really excited about. And because we're known as a kind of talent-driven company, sort of like the XYZ brand plus the director that we've sort of made a bet on, that the marketplace can kind of trust the enthusiasm and the track record. We've kind of seen in the last few years, New Zealand Film Commission were kind of first with it, and Screen Australia kind of followed, where they've cut a lot of the short funding programs and replaced it with effectively proof of concept, so the Hot Shots program, which is Screen Australia one. And that's and it's sort of indicative of where the marketplace has gone. It's very important to have strong work that is either released, like could be a short that is something that, or a previous feature or something that, or an ad or music videos or, you know, any previous work that is strong and out there, but there might also be the case of, you know, having something that maybe might give away more of the plot or might be the opening of the film or something that maybe is never shared.
Yes.
So we did a film called Bushwick in New York that's, I mean, the conceit is it's a single take action film. You know, the real feature was 16 takes kind of stitched together. But, you know, you're pitching this script and these directors, and it's a bit, you know, I think the budget's like 5 or 6 million, and people were kind of sceptical that could even be possible. So we put together a 7-minute short that was 3 takes stitched together, like digitally, that, you know, showed how we were going to drop the audience in and how the storytelling was going to work. And we show that a lot, and the film is effectively financed off the basis of this short, but we've never released it anywhere. So that's kind of another investment where there's a lot of money poured into this thing that nobody will ever see.
Yes.
But then that brings in...
But it actually worked, though.
It actually worked, yeah. So there's that. So there's the, you know, in terms of sales and pre-sales, and then also in terms of gap financing. We can be helpful. We have financiers that we work with a lot, and we can be helpful in helping, you know, bring on board financing. There's an Australian surfing film that we're doing that we're literally in the process of closing the gap, and that's something that, you know, we're just really enthusiastic about. We show it to a financier. There's another trailer that they've cut that is really interesting, and that's something we can be helpful with. And then as we're a production company as well, and that's, you know, that's much more hands-on, and we're, you know, obviously working on films from the very start and all the way through. And that's something where, yeah, it's a much more hands-on process in terms of financing. We have a production partnership with Netflix. And we made, I think, 8 Netflix originals so far. We just released Apostle last night, so you can go and watch it. And that's something that's, you know, Netflix will come in and finance the whole thing. Except in Australia, they'll have the offset, but then, you know, they're interested in pretty much paying and owning the film.
Yes.
And there's other things, and there's other different financing models, different financing and production partnerships we have around the world with various companies. And so as a production company, there's all those kind of assets are at our disposal.
Yeah. So that's interesting, actually, that just mentioned Netflix, because I think that's an interesting shift in a financial model as well, because essentially, you know, whereas with a normal, traditional film, you will go and sell it to all different parts of the world, or you'll have a sales agent who will go and take it to the rest of the world. Whereas SVODs are essentially taking it to the world, and so essentially owning all of those rights. So in that case, is that more of a fee or upfront amount of money that's paid? Because where a film has success in terms of audience reach, it's obviously different with a streaming video on demand company. Yeah,
I mean, everyone can get a nice fee up front, but there's no residuals, and there's also no feedback. I mean, we have this production partnership, but Netflix don't. They don't share figures with us. They probably don't share figures with the guys that made House of Cards, you know. So it's just the way they work. They're very protective of their algorithm, but it also it also allows them to be kind of innovative with cast feedback, where they can see what you watched, then they can see what you watched previously, then they can see what you watch next. They can see where you stopped watching, and there's all that intel. Is there's an actor called Thomas Jane who's this kind of played the Punisher years ago, and I remember we had a project with him years ago, and he sort of, you know, he kind of worked in Europe still in terms of, you know, being able to finance and, you know, sell off the back of his name, but it kind of lost its value in the US. And now then Netflix had you know, there was that, it was set in space. It's a space kind of show. They did very well on the platform, and then Zach Hilditch's 1922, the Stephen King film, has like Thomas Jane up front and centre, and the feedback, you know, speaking to Zach about that, was that they'd seen this science fiction show performing so well internationally that they could kind of bet on this actor with intel that other people kind of didn't really have.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, so you'll get a nice fee and everyone would be paid, but yeah, there's no...
Just operates very differently.
Just operates very differently, but also like they finance the movie. We have a lot of people complaining online about, you know, Netflix bought the film, like say the Apostle, Apostle came out yesterday, The Night Comes For Us comes out next Friday. These 2 quite big flagship films for us. And a lot of the fanboys online are saying, well, it's not going to come on Blu-ray, and Netflix bought it, and there's no theatrical release. And it's not, like Netflix paid for the whole movie, so it's their movie.
Yeah.
We produced it, but, you know, it's not like they bought it and they're restricting it. Like, you know, the reason, the film exists because they paid for it, you know?
Yes.
So, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, Netflix are very nimble. We're finding that a lot of people kind of quote to the Beasts of No Nation example to me about, you know, they're not going to do this and they're not going to go theatrical, but they pretty much learnt their lesson like a week after that and then changed. We've got a bunch of different release models with them, stuff that can play at festivals and then get released, you know, pretty much day and date a month later, or stuff that we can put out on, you know, exploit the theatrical rights internationally, and then it might go to Netflix 3 months later.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch of different things. They're very nimble. They're very, you know, they've got the audience, but they're very interested in awards and Oscars and Emmys and things. So they, you know, they want the prestige. They're very generous with the festival release strategy. You know, they're happy for a film to have a long festival life. You know, and we found them very supportive and interested in Australian stuff. And
Fantastic. Now, I want to make sure I give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So I will open up to questions. So if you can just raise your hand if you have a question.
I don't know if my question is specific, but with talking about the gap and talking about quake and offset, do you think that offset needs to change in order to adapt to help fix that gap and to help fix how films are now financed in Australia?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, I can say it's only money. You know.
As in the 40% and the 20%.
Yeah, I can't really talk about anything but the 40% because maybe other people can. But in terms of the 40%, there are, you know, many ways to skin a cat. But I mean, the more we can get the government to support films, the better. But the 40% is pretty useful, I must say. I mean, has changed the way. It has changed the way films are financed, and it's changed the access of producers to producers. Get that in terms of recoupment or in profit, they get that share. So it does empower producers to some degree. But this, Ladies in Black was the first feature I'd done with Quapes, and I found it endlessly complicated. So I could, you know, you need somebody who's a kind of mathematical genius to work it out. I don't know what Rosemary thinks.
I think that the offset is the greatest thing on earth, and we should protect it and love it, and don't... I get very nervous about the constant discussion about raising it and changing it. And, you know, I'm also of the view that television is 20%. Yes, it'd be great if there was more, but television also has an underpinning of broadcasters. We have Netflix and all the streamers in the market. Film needs that 40%, and we should, you know, it'd be great if it was 50, but that could be greedy.
It'd be great if it was 100.
It'd be great if it was 100.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, it's only money. It's only, you know. So
yeah, it's a
where do you
great
go?
thing that we've got, that the Canadians have got, and
Yeah,
a few other
yeah.
countries have got, but the Americans don't have it.
Belgium has 50%.
Well, Belgium, and they've got chocolates too. and
And they speak Belgian.
So
That's not.
I'm of the view that you know, you can go into the marketplace and you have 40%.
Yeah.
Of your budget already, and the world knows about that. And we've also got to protect it for ourselves, though, because there is a bit of a tendency out in the world at the moment for people to go, oh, great, you've got that 40%. Well, if you give that to me, that equity position. And we've also got to protect it because it actually, under legislation, it is for the producers. Yes, we can do what we like with it, and that's up to all of us, and directors as well. But I think we should not be critical of the offset, and I think we've got to be very careful being, I suppose, Spar's going to hate me saying this, but I think that with the governments the way they are, I just think we've got to hold on to it and make great films and just protect it. Does that sound...
No, I think it's great. I think just because I know there's people who are watching a live stream as well, that the producer offset is a federal government incentive, essentially, that for feature film, if you are spending $500,000 on what is considered qualifying Australian production expenditure, then you're eligible for a 40% tax offset. And where Sue talked earlier about that, probably working out at about 35%. So if there's any tax obligations, then they come out of that. So it ends up being around 35. But essentially, it is called the 40% producer offset. And for television, there's a 20% producers offset, and it also has some rules around it. And all of those are online, but it is an incredible thing for Australia to have. And the reason government does that is because, actually, in terms of Australia, we have a rather small population. We have a smaller population than Southern California. And it's really important to Australians, to all Australians, that we have Australian stories and that they get on screen. And we simply can't compete with places like North America, and we have the same language in terms of English, so we can watch all of the American content and British content without issue. And so these offsets and some of the legislations that are in place are really there to help us make sure we have our Australian content on screen.
I think there's an important distinction or clarification to be made as well, because the 20 and the 40, like we've made 3 projects now that have leveraged the 20%, not the 40, but they are feature film as a format. They're just not theatrically released. So most people think of, oh, okay, so 40s for movies and 20s for television. The 20% offset is actually not specifically for television. It's kind of a catch-all for everything else that doesn't make it to a cinema.
That isn't a cinema.
Right? So as long as you've got an availability to an Australian audience, whatever that looks like, then you've a long, and the obviously the expenditure qualification as well. But if you can get those 2 things in place, it's way less complex than accessing the 40. And for low budget projects, it's just a lot simpler to deal with. You know, there's less of everything along the way. There's less of the complicated maths, and you know, it's just. Most people go, oh, it's film and TV. It's actually theatrical and everything else. It's just
that's correct. And even in terms of, we're talking about feature films with Netflix, because they're not released, if they're not released in a cinema and have that theatrical release, they are 20%. Then they're not considered films, so they wouldn't get 40%, even if they spend more than $500,000 being made. So, and some of that's legacy of legislation being written before things like SVOD existed, and there, as Rosemary alluded to, there's always a fear of when you start opening up that legislation, the things that can change, which may end up not always, you're never going to get everything you want when you're asking for changes to government funding or government rules. And so there's always a risk when you start opening those things up and making changes that the great things that are there now may not exist in the same way. So I think that was what led that. Is there any other questions? Yes. So the question was, what's your opinion on self-distribution?
It's good if you can do it. It's great.
Don't ask me.
It is a lot of work, and there are. It's not to be taken lightly, but I think if you have, especially if you have niche content, or you know that you have a direct line of access to a particular audience that you can plug in. You know, because getting people, especially in Australia now, getting people off their backsides into a cinema is really difficult, probably more so than it ever has been. So most self-distribution we see happening is probably happening online, because it's a lot easier and you can focus on actually getting those audiences and getting the eyeballs to the content. Clicks are a lot easier to get than, you know, getting out of your house and going to a cinema and paying you $20, $25 to sit down. So it's not an endeavour to be taken on lightly, but I think if you can do it and do it successfully, you're actually probably way ahead of the game in some ways, but you know, that's my 2 cents.
Can I just ask a quick follow-on question from that? What would the expectation be in terms of what revenue you can generate from self-distribution?
How long's a piece of string? You know, I mean, so one example, I'm working on a project at the moment, a documentary project with the team that I made a documentary called Food Matters with. This is the 3rd time we're making a project with those guys. They've focused on nothing but audience building, and they actually have their own streaming platform at the moment, for the last 3 years, that they've built a healthy international subscription base for. And, you know, we were doing a lot of the final stages of post this week, and we were talking about some of the advanced screenings that they were having for this project, and they were filling cinemas in every city that they were screening in for a documentary that's very niche, right? But that's because they have really passionate, direct connection to a really passionate, active audience who are dying for this stuff. Every time they make a new thing, it goes gangbusters, but they operate pretty much almost completely outside of the traditional film system industry in Australia. And so most of us don't most people don't really know what they're doing.
Yes.
But when you can get 350, 400, 450 people into a screening in Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne to watch a tiny little documentary that has by most standards a really, really tiny marketing budget, I'd say that their release in a couple of weeks is going to go pretty well.
So they've built a niche following, essentially,
Yeah. And most of their audience is actually in North America and outside of Australia. So I think but I mean, I can't talk numbers. I don't know what that's going to look like. And certainly it's, what does success look like? It's very different if you've got a $500,000 project to if you've got a $5 million project, right?
But I imagine that plays too into in terms of setting up their finance model, in terms of making their content, that they understand their audience and exactly what that can look like in terms of their potential revenue back in reaching their audience in the platform.
But they also have their own little mini Netflix at the moment as well, right? I mean, it's not hundreds of millions of subscribers, but it's a significant amount of subscribers, and they just self-finance everything. They just go, this is what we're doing. They're the numbers that make sense. Let's go and do it.
Right. Great. We probably have time for one last question. Anyone wants to ask a final question? No? Yep, go ahead.
How have the budget cuts, the recent budget cuts, the ABC and SBS affected the funding gap?
Okay, so that question, I'm just saying this for the live audience. How have the budget cuts to the ABC and SBS, I guess, impacted on production?
I can speak to that. It's really tough. We rely on the ABC and SBS to put Australian stories on the screen, and they're dancing around not knowing what their budget levels are, and it's a little bit of a crisis, I think, that we're dealing with. I think that it's interesting, because I think that when you make, I think for television, it is different to sort of what we're talking about. I think the television community needs to know that, I think, how much there is at the ABC and how much is at SBS, what is their budget, and the people who work in those organisations need to know that as well, so that they can, because it takes 3 years to develop a series, so they know what their future slate holds, and it's pretty tough for them. The communities, the people who work within the organisations and the television community, I think it's quite tough for them at the moment.
Yeah.
But again, like everyone is talking, it's amazing how resilient and innovative filmmakers and storytellers are, and people are finding ways to do it and do it differently. I think it's changing the shape and the look of some of the things we're seeing on Australian television. There's lots of co-productions with Netflix. I know there's a Tracey and production companies like Hoodlum up here have done some incredible work with the ABC and ABC Studios America and BBC, BBC and ABC. So there's lots of innovative thinking about how to keep those budgets at a level that we can bring quality to the screen to counter the cuts. I think it'd be just really good to know, okay, it's certain it's this level for the next 5 years.
But there's absolutely no doubt that I think it's $85 million of existing cuts that they're already working through, and there's no doubt that is actually impacting production. Certainly as a state agency, we do a fair bit of work with SBS and the ABC, and I think what we're seeing is the ask is greater from other bodies around their contribution to that funding, which actually means, in terms of our base funding, it's not like we have lots and lots more that we suddenly have to come up with. So it's putting strain on other people's budgets to try and help cover cost to continue having that same quality. And it will impact the type of content that we're seeing on screen, because if you are partnering with international companies, they are looking for a different thing than we may be looking for in a traditional ABC show, as an example. So,
I remember there was one year that 9 hours was made or something. This is a number of years ago, that there was not Australian content on the ABC of any significance. I think that we'd all be very, very upset if that was today. I think Australians love watching ABC and SBS, and So it is something to be concerned about.
Absolutely. So I think that's all the time we've got for questions, but I would like to personally thank our entire panel for just your openness and willingness to talk through all of these things with the audience. It's been a pleasure, actually, getting to do this with you, so thank you. And thank you, GOMA, and to Brisbane International Film Festival for including this industry programming stream. It's really important to us as a screen agency, and I'm sure it's equally as important to you as people in the industry. So thank you.